My name is Leif Pagrotsky. I come from Sweden. I hope you can all see me behind this high rostrum and the laptop, or at least you can hear me, even if you're in the back. First of all, I would like to thank the Center on Capitalism and Society for inviting me to this impressive and important conference. I feel deeply honored to be here. It's the third time I've been invited, and I have appreciated it very much every time. It also provides an opportunity for me to express my admiration for the work of the Center, which now celebrates its 20th annual conference, and its founder and director, my friend, Professor Phelps. Thank you so much. For me, as a social democrat from Sweden, maybe I forgot to say I'm a politician, not an academic or an academic economist. For me, as a social democrat from Sweden, the relation between a mainly private market economy and the broader society is, of course, a crucial, fundamental issue, not only for the economies and the political future of our Western democracies, but also for the global geopolitical competition with other, less democratic systems, a competition that is more difficult today than at any other time since the Cold War. And that we today are not winning, but retreating gradually in this battle of ideas and economies. I'm convinced that this relationship is at the heart of the political problems we experience in many democracies today, not least in my own country. Traditionally, Sweden has been able to combine a rather pure, unregulated capitalist market economy with a broader society characterized by shared benefits of economic growth. A successful private sector has thus contributed to benefits for all, like quality health care and education free for all, and maintaining income security in times of sickness, unemployment, or old age. Redistributive transfer and tax policies have also contributed to mitigating the income inequalities that I believe are inherent in market economies. Mature and well-organized unions have played an important role in sharing the benefits of a successful market economy to the many, not only to the few. This has made a highly business-friendly, profitable economic system legitimate and accepted among everybody, more or less. Low taxes on business, acceptance, or even encouragement of structural change, welcoming new technologies to raise productivity, pushing for free trade, and actively welcoming or even inviting import competition. That is quite unusual, quite unique, and I think it has got a lot to do with this mix of policies I just described. This balance between capitalism and politics has been based on a fairly broad consensus. Although never free of tensions and conflicts between politics and business, between left and right, between employers and unions, its foundations were broadly shared. The high level of trust that has been such an important asset for Sweden has in recent years has been challenged by a growing feeling of exclusion, distrust of political and economic elites, and cries for change. Many people and lots of voters feel that society is on the wrong path, that everything was better in the old days. Looking back in the old days, everything was moving forward. The future looked bright and optimism ruled. Now, in contrast, the future appears uncertain and often even fearful. That is the perception among many, this nostalgia. But the reality represented by statistics and numbers gives a very different picture of life in Sweden today. Income and consumption standards have risen compared to, for example, 30 years ago. Private consumption has increased per capita by up to 60%. Housing, health, life expectancy, education standards are all on a far superior level than at any time in the past. Gender equality has made big leaps forward. Children grow up in a dramatically more favorable situation than they did in the past. That was not intended to be. So why is there such a malaise? Why is there such anger? Voters have turned their backs on all established political parties. The two main traditional parties, Conservatives and Social Democrats, have each lost a third or a quarter of their voters. Almost all the smaller parties risk being wiped out from parliament, according to recent polls. Instead, the extreme nationalistic right, the Sweden Democrats, has in a short time become the second biggest party with 20% of the votes. The party is aggressively anti-immigrant. Many people label it racist and point to its roots among Nazis when it was founded in the late 20th century. This extreme party is now the basis for the existence and survival of the conservative-led government, which consists of three smaller center-right parties. The government cannot get a single proposal through parliament without the active support of the Sweden Democrats, a support that never comes without a price. Conventional wisdom offers one unambiguous explanation. It goes like this: there are too many immigrants in Sweden, and immigration must stop. Voters vote for the party with the most extreme anti-immigration policy, and that party is the Sweden Democrats. This analysis now permeates political debate. I believe this explanation, though, is too simplistic. We must look at broader aspects of society, much broader aspects. It's true that Sweden has accepted more immigrants than most other European countries, but the correlation between immigration and right-wing populism is not convincing. If we look at 4 Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Sweden, all of them rich, advanced welfare states, historically, immigration policies have been quite different between these otherwise quite similar countries. Norway and Finland, the two countries with the traditionally most restrictive policy towards immigration, they were the ones with the earliest as well as the most powerful such nationalist, anti-elitist parties. In oil-rich Norway, to start, the Progress Party, as it's called there, became the second biggest party already in 2005 and were represented in government from 2013. They held very important positions as ministers of finance, justice, defense, immigration, and the all-important oil and energy ministry in Norway. In Finland, the other country that was not so welcoming for immigration, the extreme nationalist True Finns Party became the country's second biggest party as early as 2015 and were in government several times since then. At present, 7 out of the cabinet's 18 ministers represent the True Finns. They hold heavyweight positions as Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, Ministers of Justice, Industry, Culture, and Social Affairs. My conclusion of explaining this comparison of Nordic countries is that although immigration obviously is an important factor, it cannot alone explain the growth of right-wing nationalist parties. Neither is unemployment, poverty, or economic decline relevant factors. We have to look elsewhere. We must start by understanding why so many voters are not only unhappy, but angry. Discontent is not unusual in times of change like this, but this time is different. Changes have had more profound effects on the political landscape than we have seen in Sweden for 100 years since democracy was introduced as late as 1921. This is, of course, I believe, the consequence of a long period, not a sudden, but of a gradual and long period of dissatisfaction among voters. The traditional right-left dimension, where voters could be expected to vote according to income and profession, with blue-collar and low-paid white-collar workers voting left, and the more upscale their income and status, the more likely they were to vote to the right. This well-established pattern, based on hierarchy, or class, if you wish, has now been challenged according to new conflicts and along new lines. Patterns that have been firmly established since democracy was won 100 years ago are now being uprooted. In three important respects, rural voters and men have swung from left to right in very big numbers. Young voters are much more likely to vote conservative or nationalist than before, and that is contrary to what was expected in the media that were, I think, interpreting the Greta generation issue. Greta was obviously not representative for her generation of Swedish voters. The young voters never ever voted so much to the right as they did this time. The third one is that prosperous neighborhoods in big cities have turned the urban middle class, traditional center-right strongholds, they have turned significantly to the left, very surprisingly. The upper class areas of inner Stockholm have turned more to the left than in many, many years. What has not changed at all is the votes of women. There is a strong center-left majority among women voters before this change as it is now. And that is a permanent factor that has surprised many. The earthquake in the political landscape that I have described in Sweden and the Nordic region correspond to similar developments in other European countries. All over Europe, in different countries, with different economic and political traditions, can we see a similar development, a weakened center and a rising nationalist extreme right. And instead of spending another 10 minutes describing the European political landscape, country by country, I will show you one picture that you may have seen already now that catches the overall situation from a satellite perspective. I don't know how precise this is. It comes from the British tabloid paper, the Daily Mail. And I don't want you to read the text. And it's in EU, they missed out for some reason their own favorite revolt of the unlistened to against the elites, Brexit. So Britain is white here, although I think it should be red. The vote for Boris Johnson and Brexit, I believe, is a similar protest vote as the vote for the Sweden Democrats in Sweden. Very few EU countries appear here to be unaffected by this, and I suppose in some of these red countries it's an exaggeration, but the overall picture is quite clear. Sweden is not alone. We cannot explain what's going on with domestic individual factors. The important question is, of course, what is behind this very dramatical development in so many such different countries in such a short time? I believe economic factors are important behind this upheaval. Other factors are, as I said, of course, at work, but the relation between capitalism and society is an underlying crucial factor. It's at work in so many countries at the same time, and they cannot be overlooked. When new or small parties move from the fringe to the political arena, to influential or even powerful positions at the heart of political power, it is not only the result of these parties' skills or talents, but primarily of the failure of the established parties to maintain the trust of voters that they previously held. Two dimensions, I believe, are necessary for earning and maintaining fundamental trust in the system. First, I believe the political system needs what can be called legitimacy, that it works for the broad spectrum of the population, for all or almost all, that most people can feel that it's a system not for the few, but for the many. And second, the political system must show a degree of efficiency, that it's able to deliver decisions and results that citizens can respect. Maybe not like everything, but at least have a feeling that the system works. In Swedish politics, I believe we have failed on both these criteria. At least, maybe fail is a strong word, but something to that meaning. Disappointed voters have fled from parties left and right to the available outsider party that has not been involved in development of recent years. One could argue that, objectively speaking, Swedes are much better off now than before, and this should not be time for radical outsiders to turn the political map upside down, but that is obviously not the way it works. Instead, I believe their focus is on how their relative position has fared, and for many, that is a totally different story. Traditionally, the distributive outcomes of market forces has, as I have mentioned before, been mitigated by redistributive tax and transfer policies. But for some decades now, this has been reversed. A swing to the right among voters has made it possible, but only rare and this reversal has become possible with only timid objections from economists or even active support from the economists active in public debate. Taxes on wealth and inheritance have been abolished. Taxes on capital gains and dividends from shares have been reduced to symbolic levels. The top income tax bracket has been abolished. Property tax on real estate, which was proportional before, has now been replaced by a flat sum for most houses, and it is very low and very beneficial. For an average family house in Stockholm, the property tax now is about 0.1% of the market value of the house. And that cut, together with low interest and the fact that not everybody owned their apartments and their houses, has meant very, very big inequalities in wealth. At the same time, important transfers like health and unemployment insurance have been made less generous. Offers of upskilling or retraining for those hit by unemployment have also been cut back. These rather dramatic reversals of previous policy have contributed to sharply increasing inequality. And shifting the tax burden away from unearned income, like inheritance, dividends, and capital gains, while an increased share of taxation is levied on wages and consumption, has of course widened gaps between those who benefit from prosperity and those who do not. There is a very clear pattern about these changes. They benefit mostly people in bigger cities with better education and higher incomes. Very little end up in rural areas. I don't find it surprising that sorry, I was distracted and I lost track. There is a very clear pattern about these changes, and very little of them end up in rural areas. People now have an attitude that politicians do not represent the interests of ordinary people anymore. Instead, they favor the privileged that benefit from these policies of recent years. I believe this has contributed to the loss of legitimacy for the traditional political parties. They all share this development. Not one party is responsible for it all, and no party is beyond part of the blame. So it's not by accident that the Sweden Democrats are very strong in the areas that have not benefited and weak in the areas that have benefited from this. And they have successfully positioned themselves as the voice of the people versus the establishment, of the outsiders versus the insiders, of the periphery versus the center. The other factor, apart from the legitimacy factor I just mentioned, affecting trust in the political system is efficiency, the ability to deliver. Increased international dependence has reduced the room for maneuver for all countries, but in particular for smaller countries. Taxation of capital and corporate profits are two important examples. On top of this, politicians have chosen themselves to reduce the reach of political decisions by deregulation and privatization. Many or even most of these changes have been positive or even necessary, seen one by one. And I must admit that I have been in favor of many or even most of these changes, sometimes strongly so in my role as a cabinet minister. But it's nevertheless a reality that the room for domestic policy to be delivered by national politicians that can be accountable to the voters in our own country, that has become more limited. Politicians appear to be victims of events and external forces, more like bystanders than in charge, more commenting developments than taking charge and responsibility for development. There is one further element of politics. This is the final point in this respect. In Sweden and other European countries, with a proportional parliamentary political system that erodes the perception of politics in charge and accountable. More parties have been elected to parliament. This has brought a more diverse political landscape with more minority or coalition governments. Voters get a confusing perception of who's in charge and where responsibility rests. Often policies are unable to address problems of the day because of this political reality. This too paves the way for new anti-establishment forces with promises for fundamental change, often based on charismatic leaders with simple solutions, easy to communicate, and never tested against reality. We don't have to go as far as the Weimar Republic or the Yeltsin years in Russia to remind ourselves that democracy not only needs formal rules for voting and representation to be respected and supported by everybody. Democracy also needs to be effective. Hung parliaments, gridlock, and paralysis risk paving the way for extreme alternatives. Economists have been very influential in shaping developments in my country and in Europe since the 1980s. More power to markets, less to politics. Privatization and market mechanisms for public service have been like mantras for the past generation or so, also in my country. These changes have, as I said, have many positive effects in many areas. We've had a very good economic development overall, but we have not been aware of these side effects that we can see now, and we have not paid enough attention to what these reforms have meant for respect and legitimacy for our democracy and our politics. And I believe this has contributed to the backlash against established politics that we have seen in the past. And maybe it's time for politics to take back control, some of it at least, or at least stop the habit of moving important issues further away from politically accountable politicians. Let me, I think my time is up. So I thank you for listening. And I have one more thing to say. I want our democratic capitalism improved so it becomes obvious to the whole world that this is the best system the world has ever seen. That's the most important our generation can do to fight authoritarianism that I think now is on the offensive. Thank you.